Well, good morning, everybody. As you have it in your programs, Ambassador Darlington Mwape, who is a senior fellow with ICTSD, should have chaired this meeting, but for personal reasons, he had to, I understand, fly back urgently back home. So we're hoping everything will be fine, and then I'll improvise, and we'll be very pleased and happy to be with you here. This is a meeting that we have organized in cooperation with the government of Finland, and we're going to be looking at global value chains and how to foster value chains in the regional context, specifically in Africa. I think what I should do is, well, other than welcome you right now, turn the floor first to Ambassador Päivi Kairamo from Finland, to give some remarks, and then we'll take the meeting from there. So, Ambassador Kairamo, you have the floor.
Thank you so very much. Good morning, everyone. Also on my behalf, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, and I'm also very happy to note, the presence of a Finnish member of European Parliament. Thank you very much for, coming here for a while. Allow me to say, a few introductory remarks before the actual panel discussion will start. It is indeed my great pleasure to welcome you to this session on regional value chains in Southern Africa, organized, as you already heard, jointly by the Permanent Mission of Finland and the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development. Our theme for this morning is indeed very topical. The world community adopted the new Sustainable Development Goals just last week in New York to guide us in our work for the next 15 years. Sustainable economic growth will be a key component in our efforts to eradicate poverty and to promote social development and environmental protection by 2030. Our session today will focus on regional interaction, or actually on how regional interaction can help reach economic growth and sustainable development. Tapping into international trade through regional and global value chains is one of the key elements. Mobilizing all human resources available, including women, to contribute to the economy is another. Our session will draw from some concrete experiences in Southern Africa, a region where my own country, Finland, has been engaged in a number of aid for trade activities over the years. Regarding regional trade, the recent launch of the tripartite free trade area between three largest regional economic communities of Africa, namely COMESA, EAC and SADC, is a positive step as it opens more opportunities for economic growth in the region. Many African countries are very determined to get into the path of steady economic growth and job creation. Diversification of existing production base and increasing the value-added content of production are important factors in this respect. Given that higher levels of intra-regional trade are closely linked with the development of manufacturing sector, means that efforts to increase integration are very decisive. Foreign direct investment can provide an important support for both tapping into the regional and global value chains and for industrial development. Larger common markets mean larger economies of scale and help attract investments. This session will examine how value chains development in Southern Africa could lead to deeper interregional trade and thus enable countries to better reap the benefits of international trade. Agro-industry seems to be one particularly well-placed sector to offer opportunities for boosting intra-regional trade and eventually integrating deeper into global value chains. We will also hear how aid for trade can act as a catalyst for boosting the participation of developing countries and particularly LDCs in regional production networks and enabling them to connect and move up in global value chains. Today, we will hear some practical examples of these. In this context, I would like to mention that the government of Finland supports the International Trade Center in its work to promote intra-regional trade in agricultural sector in 3 African countries, namely in Kenya, Tanzania and Zambia. We will also hear more from this work during the session. Ladies and gentlemen, our session today will also tackle gender aspects in value chains. Finland is a long-term supporter of the promotion of gender equality. It is our firm understanding that no country can reach its full potential and its full economic potential until women can reach their full potential. International trade can be a powerful tool to empower women, yet global trade and value chains tend to treat women and men differently. The global trade community must pay attention to this. Trade policies have a role to play. National policies have their role to play. The Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Finland has commissioned a report on gender equality in global value chains. And I will show you the report, which you will find, at least some copies are available outside, this, meeting room. And obviously, of course, the report is already available through internet, i.e. if you Google, for example, the words gender equality in global value chains, you will find the report, through internet. And I'm very happy to note that the author of the report is present here today and is a member of this panel, i.e. Johanna Silvander. And finally, obviously, again, thank you very much to our partner, International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development, and I indeed hope that you will have a very interesting session this morning, and I hope that you will have interesting interaction with the panel members. Thank you so very much.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. Okay. With that framing, now let me, and now that I got my nameplate here, introduce myself more properly. So I'm Ricardo Melendez Ortiz. I'm the head of the International Center for Trade and Sustainable Development. Again, I'm sitting for Ambassador Darlington Moape, who had a family problem. I had to go back to Africa in a rush, but I'm very happy to be here. A couple of days ago, we had a panel looking at global value chains from the global perspective here in this same room. And so as an introduction, very briefly, just to complement some of the words of Ambassador, that Ambassador of Finland, Ambassador Karamo, just said, I'll just contextualize by saying that the phenomenon of global value chains is one that has taken us a bit by surprise in the policy area. In ICTSD, we started looking at this back in 2000, 2001. We had the first meeting with the Global Value Chain Analysis Network at that time, looking at what was happening and trying to understand how was it that production was getting fragmented in various jurisdictions, where was this happening, and so on. But again, from a trade policy perspective particularly, it was hard to understand how trade policy was really being a factor or having an effect on the evolution of those value chains. That was at the global level mostly. I think when the topic got here, particularly to the WTO and to trade policy spheres, the curiosity was about, obviously, it led to trying to come up with better efforts to describe what was going on. And what we have seen in terms of the work here in the WTO now, follow up by the OECD and the World Bank and so many other people, it's again a major effort to try to understand in detail with the little information that we have and trying to extract information from firms particularly about how this happens and what are the drivers and then what are the implications for public policy concerns. I think it's fair to say that we're still in that diagnosis phase, and we're just now coming to a better understanding and articulation of how policy should respond to this phenomenon, and then how to generate the environment that should see value chains spread beyond sort of the regional, the major hubs of that have driven value chains and congregated value chains in the global economy, and particularly how to ensure that they also occurred in the South, and that they result in benefits that are more widely spread. This is why I think that the initiative of the Finnish government to undertake this research on the gendered dimension is so important at this stage. One of the big questions on value chains is about inclusiveness, and that's this research goes straight into that, and that's why we very much we were very excited to see that you're doing this, and are very happy to participate in disseminating the findings, and then going further into trying to understand how to bring this gender dimension more into the policy area. Some of the challenges of value chains have to do with upgrading. It has to do with not only with participation, but also with upgrading in the value chain itself, capturing the gains from value chain, trying to make sure that SMEs, who make most of the fabric of economies today all over the world, but particularly in the developing world, also have a participation in those value chains. And again, when you look at the study by Johanna Sylvander, we find that there are some responses and some findings that would help get some better responses from the policy perspective into these issues. So let me just move into the panel today. What we thought is that applying ourselves to Southern Africa to start with, as we look into these issues in the South, is a very good start. It gives us a very good possibility of trying to understand how to particularly foster, as it says in this title of this meeting, the regional integration and the generation of value chains and the capturing of value through value chains at that regional level. We'll start with a presentation by Professor Mike Morris from the University of Cape Town, who will focus particularly on the South African region. So, Professor Morris, you have the floor.
Well, welcome everybody, and thank you to the ICTSD for inviting me to come and speak to you all. I see that having meetings at 9 o'clock in Geneva is a lot like home. People don't always pitch up early enough to have them. I'm going to figure out how this works. Oh, there we are. Okay. I've got 15 minutes, which is not a long time. Some of it's been taken away already. So I'm going to go fairly quickly through some of the early stuff, which I'm sure you know. Otherwise, you wouldn't be sitting here. So the first question that one has to look at is, why is trade, that is exports, particularly important for industrialization and for Southern Africa? These are, I don't have to explain this to you. It's about unlimited markets, scale economies, the importance of them, developing specialized capabilities. They're an important and valuable source of learning. I will come back to this. And the key question here is, as Ricardo said, it's about upgrading, i.e. it's about building dynamic capabilities. So the point about all of this is to put domestic industries on a trajectory of profitability, of upgrading social and economic, increasing productivity, resulting in structural transformation, and as a consequence, economic growth. I need to make one particular point. Trade in and of itself does not lead to economic growth. If that was simply the case, it would be a simple solution to all the world's problems. Everybody globalizes, everybody engages in trade. We can throw away policy. We don't need to ask the question that the chairperson has asked: what is the relationship between global value chains and and policy for trade. The key question is therefore the way I phrase it with my colleagues that I work with. By the way, there are two colleagues not present who are, should be reflected. That's Professor Rafał Kapliński from the UK and Dr. Cornelia Starrett from Vienna, who I work with a lot. And the mantra that we use is that it's not whether to engage in globalization, but it's rather how you participate in the global economy and with what resources that makes the difference in regard to industrialization. Okay, so from the perspective of this particular workshop, there are two major trends in global economies that I want to isolate. The first one is actually the heart and the beginning of the importance of global value chains. There's been a shift in final products to an arm's length transactions, which very much characterized the previous period of internationalization. You could call it globalization, but it was a trade in final products that characterized the major thrust, for example, at the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century. There's been a shift from trade in final products and arm-length transaction to intermediate goods, and as a consequence, the rise of supply chains, of offshoring, of outsourcing, and hence of obligational relationships. I'm not going into this, the whole theoretical framework of this, but the importance of this is it gave rise to global value chains. Global value chains and the global dispersion of production throughout the world, all based upon outsourcing and offshoring. And this has taken place not only in manufacturing, but also in commodities, agriculture, services as well. The increase, as a result of this increase in intermediate goods has a fundamental impact upon the way we look at trade, by the way. I mean, that is why the major trade organizations now are recalculating the trade statistics, because they've been double counting for some time. If you look at the data, just briefly, to show the importance of this, it is now estimated that 66 to 80% of global trade is taking place in global value chains, and intermediates are composing 50% of global trade. In other words, components that go into components that go into components that go into the Apple iPhone that finishes up in the United States or China, or a few of us also managed to get it in the rest of the world. It says made in China, but it's not. It's actually assembled in China, and it's a result of a chain of intermediate goods that have been put together. So this is one major change. The other major change, which is the focus, and I've spent too much on the previous one, is the expansion of intra-regional trade due to the importance of regional trade agreements and value chains that are operating in these regions that have a need for flexibility and geographical proximity of suppliers. And later on I'll speak about the clothing sector in Southern Africa, where the lead firms, the retailers, do not just want to source everything from China because they lose flexibility, which they gain from geographical proximity of suppliers. And this fosters the whole question of regional integration and the rise of regional value chains. The key take-home lesson there, which I'll repeat time and time again, is preferential trade access agreements are absolutely critical for the rise of value chain relationships in a region. Sorry, I pressed the wrong thing. Okay, so let's understand some of the data quickly around inter-regional trade. If you look at this table quickly, there are two big things that come out of this. There's been a rise of inter-regional trade, three actually, a rise of intra-regional trade globally. Developing Asia is the greatest source of this, and Africa lags far behind. From 1996 to 2000, it's simply an increase of 9.7 to 10.9, which is Africa lags behind. That's the first lesson. However, if you look at the share of Southern African exports by region, so where the exports are going to, what we see here is there's an increase in intra-sub-Saharan African trade in a substantial way, from 16.5 to 18.5. The biggest increase is the share of exports to developing Asia, which is the global trend that we were talking about. And there's been a decrease of exports from sub-Saharan Africa by region to developed Europe and to developed America of quite a substantial basis over the last decade or two. The same story applies to East Africa. It's just that the figures are a little bit higher in terms of intra-sub-Saharan African trade. Exports from East Africa much higher than sub-Saharan, than Southern Africa. And less to developing Asia than there is from the Southern African region, but the same decrease in share to Europe. If we try and break this down, and I don't want to put more tables here, if we break this down, there's a critical question. What's the role of manufacturers in this particular process? If we strip out commodities, mining, raw materials, etc. And this is actually quite surprising. The share of sub-Saharan African manufacture exports to the world is only 13.4%. But the share of intra-trade in manufactures in sub-Saharan Africa is 41.9%. This is for 2012. I've got data for the previous periods, and it goes up and down, and there's been a decrease. But that's not my point. The trend is not my point here. My point is the contrast between the share to the rest of the world and the share to intra-sub-Saharan Africa. In terms of Southern African manufacturers, the export share to the world is 20.2%, but once again, the share to intra-sub-Saharan Africa is 53.5%. The same thing operates with regard to East Africa, and you can all read, so I'm not going to go and repeat that. You've got the point. Okay. The key, this doesn't specify that all of this is trade in global value chains. That's another exercise altogether. Some of this may be some little guy making something or other and selling it across, the border, and he takes it himself, and there's not a regional value chain of any substance being involved here. And we need to disaggregate this stuff. But what it does say is that regional integration is important, and manufacturers is playing an important role in this. So now I want to leave this alone now and take us back to the question of value chains. How am I doing on time there, sir? Okay. Okay, the key thing is that global value chains predominate globally in manufacturing and services. They account for more than 75% of global exports. But, here's the kicker, for Africa, they account for only 25% of African exports. GVCs also dominate in the resource sector. They account for less than 25% of global GVC trade, but more than 75% of Africa's GVC trade. So the problem for Africa is how do we increase manufacturing in terms of and participating in global value chains, and how do we also make sure that the 75% of Africa's GVC trade is about capturing value rather than simply exporting raw materials. That's the big GVC kicker from that. Now, Rafi and I have developed, we've been working in global value chains since about 1998. It took a long time for the global world to take notice, of this question. Now you go around, everybody says they believe in value chains. And they've always been working on value chains. They just take what they did before and put the word value chain in front. We've tried to differentiate between two different major GVC families, and I have to take you through this quickly to make sense of Southern African integration. The one we call vertically specialized global value chains, and the other one we call additive global value chains. In other words, value is being added in the latter phase, vertically specialized value is being fragmented and reassembled again in different parts, of the world. So what are vertically specialized global value chains? One, they predominate in manufacturing and services, and we saw that from my couple of slides back. They are the result of the simultaneous fragmentation of production into many stages, complex and extended chain links. It's the basis of, it's the salami slicing up of production and globally dispersing it. It takes place not in a linear fashion, but in a parallel fashion. So the flows are not necessarily linear at all. They're not necessarily sequential. They're not always necessarily additive. They're fragmented, and they mostly occur in parallel. When I'm making one thing for BMW, somebody else is making something else for BMW. They have nothing to do with each other until much later on. Preferential market access plays a really important part, often in this regard, in entry into a GV, global value chain, And not surprising, they dominate in Asia. This is the rise of the Southeast Asian manufacturing miracle, actually. It's all about vertically specialized value chains. It's about specializing in particular kinds of activities, production activities. It's building dynamic capabilities on a narrow basis and then later on expanding them. So the policy challenge here is how do you thin out, not fatten out? How do you thin out your productive activities, develop your specialist capabilities, and then later, fatten out your production? In other words, disperse and spread the global footprint in your manufacturing sector. And that's what the best examples coming out of Southeast Asia are all about. So what are additive value chains? Additive value chains are what they say they are. One, they dominate in the resource sectors, but it's important to see it goes beyond the extraction process. If you only focus on commodities and extraction, you are not involved in an additive value chain of any worthwhile substance to yourself. These are linear and they are sequential. If you think about growing cocoa, for example, you grow cocoa, you get beans, you do things to the beans, you grade them, you sort them, etc., etc., and the final product of this whole thing is cocoa extract, and then you make, coffee, and not coffee, chocolate, etc., etc. These are additive processes. One can't take place without the other. They depend upon production linkages. In mining, it's backward production linkages, and in agro-processing, it's all about forward processes. And so the additive nature goes forward. What this means is that there's a process of value capture that's taking place, and the critical question is it taking place, the value capture, in the country, or in the region, or outside the region? Is it taking place in Europe, Southern Africa, South Africa, etc., etc.? So the policy challenge here is how do you deepen value added, how do you capture value, and how do you do this through backward and forward linkage development? That's the industrialization challenge, actually, for Africa in many senses. I'm not going to get through this. How much time have I got? 2 minutes. Okay. I'm going to skip this. Okay. The story here is that from many perspectives, there's a similarity between vertically specialized regional value chains and between additive. It's all about becoming competitive by building capabilities, by focusing upon knowledge-intensive types of activities, by trying to move into more rent-rich or value-added types of activities. That's the fundamental story that accords with both of them. However, there are fundamentally different kinds of policies that also that are applicable to these different kinds of value chains. So I'm going to now just take two quick looks at two quick looks at two different value chains in order to get the point. There's been a major rise of apparel, of garments, on a regional basis in Southern Africa. The initial stage of this was simply preferential trade access through AGOA to the US and to the EU. They were dominated by East Asian transnational firms who had all the linkages in value chains. But now what has happened since 2006 is the emergence of a new regional market to South Africa, and this has given a massive spurt to a whole new process of regional integration in this vertically specialized garment production. Some quick data to show you this. The share of exports to South Africa in total sub-Saharan exports of apparel has jumped from 1% to 16%, 2004 to 2012. South African imports from sub-Saharan Africa have jumped from 5% to 25%. Who are the countries that are doing this? Mauritius now exports 18% of apparel to South Africa. Madagascar exports 13% to South Africa. These figures are only 2012, and it's much more now in 2014 data. Okay. Lesotho exported 90. At the regional market by moving into that. Institutional training capabilities, these are absolutely critical. It's not only workers that need training, it's management as well. They don't understand world-class manufacturing. There's a major policy issue around cross-border cooperation because what you have is the flow of goods, knowledge, and people. So trade facilitation, infrastructure, regulatory upgrading, all things are important. The second last question. We can't talk about industrial policy anymore. We have to talk about productive sector policy. It's productive policy. Why? Because we need to apply this to manufacturing, services, agro-processing, and the creation of synergies between all of these three groups. Thank you very much. My apologies for taking too much time.
No apologies at all. Thank you very much, Professor Morris. I think that's fascinating, really. It's almost music to my ears, at least when I hear the kind of findings that you are presenting here, because for so many years we've tried to understand specifically what you're talking about. So what's happening really at the regional level, how value chains can be, there would be the mutual supportiveness of value chains being a driver for regional integration, but also regional integration being absolutely critical for fostering these value chains. So looking at the details is what gives you really the information that we need and can really get us into the policy discussion. So thank you for that presentation. I'll just make a quick additional remark related to the point that the Ambassador Kairamo just made before, which is the link to the SDGs. And so in this case, in this region, we're looking also at the participation of LDCs in international trade. And with some of the data that you're looking at, we're also already looking also at the SMEs and how SMEs are incorporating themselves into value chains. One of the very specific targets on trade in the SDGs is it's one that is a huge challenge for everybody concerned with policy, and it's how to double the share of LDC exports between now and 2020 in global trade. And it's stated like that. There is a commitment to double that share of exports of LDCs. And I think that this that we're looking at here is essential in that respect. I'll turn now to my colleague, Dr. Vinay Denchadas, who's a senior development economist at ICTSD, and he's been looking at the impact of value chains precisely on the question of SDGs, and the Lesotho case, looking at the apparel industry. So, Vinay.
Oh, God. I just destroyed your system.
Thank you, Ricardo. Mike presented a very nice sort of background to what I'm going to talk about, specifically focusing on the Lesotho value chain. If you look at the title of the presentation, we're not talking about apparel value chain, but apparel value chains in the plural. So the point that I'm going to make in this presentation is basically that there are two types of value chains that are operating out of Lesotho. One which is global, so basically Lesotho producing to export to the US under AGOA, essentially. And the second one, which Mike mentioned also, is Lesotho producing to export to South Africa, taking advantage of regional preferences. As you know, Lesotho is part of SACU, is part of the SADC. This is the regional arrangement which offers trade preferences and therefore facilitates regional trade. Specifically, I'm going to look at SDGs. So I think this is an innovative strand of work that we are doing at ICTSD, looking at how global value chains are impacting on sustainable development from the perspective of the 17 SDGs. So here, this presentation is really work in progress. It's really inception of the work in a way, but it does provide a framework. So I have listed the SDGs here. Okay, how do we think of value chains impacting on SDGs? You can think of it in terms of direct impacts and indirect impacts. So the indirect impacts would be through the income channel or the growth channel, okay? Value chains, as you know, are associated with trade, are associated with industrialization, and those are avenues for economic growth. And when there is growth, obviously, there is poverty reduction. Hopefully, there will be poverty reduction. As we know, a lot of growth happening in Africa is because it's not inclusive, is not necessarily resulting in poverty reduction in the way that we would have wished. But by and large, economic growth means a bigger pie, and when the pie is bigger, it is possible for everyone to get a bigger slice of it. So economic growth can lead to poverty reduction. Economic growth also can affect, so that's already SDG 1. Economic growth also can affect definitely employment and decent work, which is SDG 8, and also industrialization innovation. So these are the SDGs which have a direct link to economic growth, as you can see. But then there are other indirect impacts on economic growth. For example, when an economy grows, when the level of per capita income increases, people get richer, and as people get richer, generally the demand for services increases, demand for services like health and education, and those are SDGs 3 and 4. And then you have the direct impacts, direct impact of, on, for example, gender and employment. I'm going to talk about it, how GVCs are actually impacting on gender and employment. Obviously, GVCs result in job creation, but do they also result in a better gender maybe better pay, better working conditions and all that. And that is related to social upgrading. So social upgrading refers really to better jobs, okay? Very simply, better jobs. So if you want to measure it, it would be in terms of working hours, or you working shorter hours, in terms of health and safety, in terms of employment, essentially, do you have more job security? And in terms of the enabling rights, discrimination, is gender equality being achieved? Is there freedom of association? Can you join unions and all that? Now, it's very tempting to think of economic upgrading leading to social upgrading. In fact, and this is what has been demonstrated by the literature, there is no such relationship. There is no link between the two, okay? You can have economic upgrading happening independently of social upgrading, upgrading happening independently of economic upgrading, or actually social downgrading taking place even when there is economic upgrading. So you have a chart here which tells you that you have all these different combinations going on. Now, very quickly, you know this probably. You can see how exports to the U.S. Took off in 2001 after with the coming in effect of AGOA. And then you see, and this is what Mike was alluding to, exports to South Africa becoming a bit more significant. Still, the whole thing is dominated by exports to the US, but South Africa is emerging as a fairly significant regional player, especially from around 2005, and that coincides with the end of the multi-fiber agreement, which dealt a serious blow to the South African textile industry, pushing South African investors to look into the region. In terms of employment, currently the Lesotho textile industry employs close to 40,000 people, and it's estimated that 3/4 of that actually are women. And a very interesting fact is that even though a lot more is exported to the to the US, okay, there are actually many more firms producing for South Africa than there are for producing for the US, meaning that the firms producing for the US market are few but much bigger. On average, they employ twice as many workers as the average firm producing for the South African market. So roughly same number of firms, but obviously exposed to the US are much bigger, and employment in the factories producing for the US market also is much bigger. Now, I want to go very quickly through this, just to make the point that we have undertaken two detailed studies of two firms in Lesotho. One is Formosa, which is a Taiwanese company producing to export to the US, and the other one is Johnson's, which is actually a South African firm exporting to South Africa. If you look at the dynamics of these two different value chains, so obviously Formosa is what I call a global value chain. Johnson's is what I call a regional value chain, and you can see aspects of those as we go along. So Formosa, the US value chain, is a global value chain. It's buyer-driven, okay, and that's a very important point. Johnson's is regional, and it's supplier-driven. Supplier-driven means that the supplier has a say in what is offered. So the supplier can actually propose design, okay? In a buyer-driven value chain, everything in a way is imposed upon the firm, and the firm just produces to whatever specifications are set. Now, very interesting point, which is the last bullet there, the production costs. It turns out that in both value chains, the production costs take away a huge chunk of the value, okay? And what is left to the firm is really, our fieldwork shows that firms on average make a margin of 8 to 10%, which is really very small. We have this very interesting, again, this is work in progress, we obviously will look into it again. If you take, for example, and this is what we try to do, take the value of a polo shirt, for example, okay, that is produced and exported to the US. Okay, the average price of that polo shirt is $54. Okay, now what does the factory get out of this? $10. $10 out of 54, and these $10 are non-negotiable. The retailer tells you that's what we can offer. And that you can understand why, because they're operating in a globally competitive environment. If you don't accept $10, they will just go somewhere else, okay? And out of the $10 now, the firm has to bear all these costs. And it turns out at the end of the day, you're left with a very small margin. The point really is that the value is captured at the end of the value chain. And again, I don't think this is a revelation, you know it already. But what probably would be fascinating is the extent of the value that is captured at the far end. Really, almost all of it is captured by retailers. Okay, let me go to the impacts. How much time you have? Okay. Very, very quickly. we find that, so we look at, for example, how do the two types of value chains impact on the Sustainable Development Goals. And we have looked specifically at goal on ending poverty, gender equality and empowerment, water and sanitation, and goals and similar goals. Now, instead of going through the slides, let me just give you the broad picture. The broad picture is, unfortunately, not a very positive one. We find that, remember, we are talking about an industry which is predominantly female-based, okay? About 75% of the industry 75% of the workforce being women. We find that in Lesotho, the most firms pay the basic minimum wage, which is set by the government, and that wage, that amounts to a salary, monthly salary of about $4.2. Sorry, that's daily. $4.2. Now, you might say that $4.2 is much higher than 1.25, which is the usual World Bank poverty line. But mind you, each worker on average has 5 dependents, people who actually depend on on that worker directly or indirectly. So if you were to take the $4.20 and divide it by 4, you get like 80 cents, and that's much below the poverty line. So what is happening is that workers actually are not getting enough. And then when you look at the costs actually of living in the capital city where the factory is, well, there are some also outside. So what happens is transportation takes away a big chunk of their salary, okay? Rent takes away a big chunk of it. So at the end of the day, they are really left with almost nothing. And if you're young and you're just joining, you don't have a family, so you just spend. So I think this problem is more with the youth, okay? If you have a family, children, you probably have, you're more serious, you want to save a bit. So what we find is that access to the formal credit market also is not you don't have access. So what happens is these people are forced to borrow from what I call loan sharks, and those people are exploiting these women, charging very high interest rate, leaving them really nothing at the end of the day. So if you really think about it, we see that there is what I call some evidence of pervasive evidence actually of social downgrading. So you can go like that on each SDG and assess what impact the value chain has made. And at the end of the day, as I was saying, the impact is not very positive. Now, so as I was saying, the impact is not very positive, but that is only because we are taking a fairly narrow sort of focus, which is looking at workers. But mind you, and this is what the literature has done, the literature has inevitably focused on workers and concluded that workers are not getting much out of these value chains. But when you have to consider the broader developmental benefits of global value chains. So for example, what I call the broader multiplier effects. How do global value chains affect suppliers of services? We find actually that a lot of the services that clothing firms need are supplied by local suppliers. So they benefit also, okay? Transportation, logistics, electricity, water, and all of that. And then the question of local embeddedness, which is tied to what I was saying. How much of linkages does the industry actually have with the local economy? So on the whole, it's difficult to really conclude. Unless you take into account all the broader dimensions, okay? It's difficult to say that, it's difficult to say whether value chains have had a positive or negative impact. But if you take the narrow focus of looking at workers, then by and large we find that, and this is not only what we found in our study, but it's widely documented, that you have some social downgrading. Now, just to conclude, if I have 1 minute, Ricardo. So when we compare the global value chain with the regional value chain, and we find that, unfortunately, I didn't have time to take you in detail through that. We find that by and large, the regional value chain has some more positive aspects associated to them. For example, they pay workers more. They don't only pay the basic wage, they pay more. They have a training program for workers. They are more compassionate towards workers. For example, maternity leave at Johnson's, which is the South African firm, is 12 weeks compared to only 6 weeks at Formosa, which is the Taiwanese. So on those aspects, you can see that the regional firms are more sort of positive. And they're also obviously more integrated in the region. They tend to use more of local suppliers. And so when you look at those broader dimensions, you see that regional value chains actually have a much bigger impact on the local economy than the global value chains do. In terms of policy implications, very briefly, there is a need for infrastructure investment, obviously, because if you really want to capture value, you need to go into a more complex segments of the value chain, and that requires shorter lead times, so proximity to markets. So infrastructure is very important. The role of training, you need to be investing in training, and so on and so forth. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Vinay. We have issues with the different interpretation of 15 minutes that we have on the table, but and the little time we have, and the fact that we started so late. So let me sort of immediately turn to Johanna. Just say that this research Vinay is referring to is going to be available soon. It's very rich in detail as well, and the issue there also is to make sure that we extract what is relevant for trade policy and what is relevant for other flanking policies, particularly at the domestic level there. Johanna, we're really in great expectation to listen to you.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. Mike and Vinay have provided a good analysis of the GVCs and regional value chains in the southern Africa and links to SDGs. I will be focusing on gender, so I will not describe so much the GVCs themselves. Good. If I start with the conclusions, I would say global value chains have provided many new job opportunities and income generating opportunities for women and men worldwide. And GVCs tend to particularly have this aspect of employing women. At the same time, these opportunities cannot be fully benefited from if gender inequality is not eliminated. A bit about the presentation, the outlines. First of all, the study. As the ambassador of Finland mentioned, I'm speaking based on a study which was funded by the Ministry for Foreign Affairs of Finland in 2013. I carried it out as an independent consultant. At the moment, I work at the ILO, so what I'm saying here today does not necessarily represent the views of the ILO, which is important to say. In terms of the outline, I will look at global trends in terms of global value chains and gender equality. I will also present very briefly some case studies focusing on Africa, then looking at how different actors could promote, improve gender equality, and how could aid for trade help in the process. What the study was focusing on was to look at what is the gender picture in global value chains. So where do women work, where do men work? What are the working conditions like? What are gender-based constraints in global value chains? And what can different actors do to improve the social upgrading that Vinay also mentioned, in addition to the economic upgrading? And then to draw some conclusions on that basis, the study is a literature review. So looking at the global trends, new wins but old patterns. So looking at the new wins first. As I said, global value chains have provided a multitude of new job opportunities, particularly for women in developing and emerging economies. Value chains both create and destroy jobs, because from somewhere production is relocated to somewhere else in many cases. At the same time, developing economies have seen significant increases in job opportunities, and particularly for women. Women's share of the global workforce has increased in the three past decades, to about 41% from 38%, according to UNCTAD. Women make up about 50 to 90% of export processing zone workers in different developing regions. So there you can see the magnitude of women's work here. Jobs in global value chains may sometimes come with better wages and better working conditions than jobs purely related to the domestic economy. Sometimes the kind of strategies are used, as Vinaya was mentioning, social dumping as well. But for many women, these might represent the first formal jobs they have. Also, jobs outside home-based work and traditional agriculture may provide women with an opportunity to increase their independence in the household and their agency, ability to take decisions at the household level. Then the old patterns. The global value chains are strongly gender segregated, so men and women are in different jobs, and men are more broadly represented in different sectors than women. Women are more narrowly concentrated, and they are also more in low-skilled and low-skilled jobs and low productivity sectors overall. Feminization has mostly concerned manual work. So based on a perception of women as dexterous, kind, and submissive. This is not always the case, but these are some of the trends. And some researchers have argued that maybe this relates to the nature of global value chains, where there's a lot of time pressure on production, pressure on pricing, as Vinaya also mentioned, and at the same time pressure for high quality, and the need for a buffer for peaks of production. Also, when there's more technology involved in production, the jobs tend to become male-dominated again. And this is again based on social norms or perceptions on differences between women and men, not relating to actual capacities, but on perceptions. Also, different waves of globalization have benefited different kinds of worker categories. So first, after the Second World War, most jobs were created in manual labor, whereas in the recent 15 years, it's more about high-skilled jobs. So why cannot women fully benefit from new opportunities? On the basis of it are social norms, really, because a lot of it is based on perceptions. First of all, time. So women don't have as much time to take advantage of economic opportunities as men, usually, because women have the responsibility, the main responsibility, to take care of the household. So this creates many constraints for women, which have relate with, for example, participation in training, ability to travel, ability to organize their working time, etc. In terms of production factors, women don't have the same abilities to access factors of production as men. For example, loan requirements many times discriminate against women. For example, if there's a collateral requirement or a land ownership requirement. Also, land policies tend to be not favoring women. Institutions, since they are based on social norms many times, tend to disfavor women. Let's go quickly to the Lesotho case study. The importance of preferential trade arrangements has been mentioned by the previous speakers, and again, so there's been a huge growth of job opportunities or jobs In Lesotho, in the textiles industry, AGOA agreement to the U.S. and preferential access to the U.S. and also SACU towards South Africa is instrumental here. According to the materials I've gone through, 70 to even 98% of the sector's workers would be female. Vinaya mentioned 3/4, but a great majority in any case. So job opportunities have been presented to women in this sector. At the same time, there are gaps in job quality. There's low employment protection, so jobs directly refer to exports. When exports slow down, jobs are also lost. Severance pay only provides short-term relief. There are gaps in social security, so social security related to employment, so unemployment benefits, etc., don't exist. Jobs are mostly permanent and full-time, however. Salary levels are low, minimum wage is lowest of all sectors. Women tend to be in low-skilled jobs and gain limited skills through their jobs. So, for example, a worker might not know how to put together a whole garment, just a part of it. And this will also limit their possibilities, these workers' possibilities to find jobs outside the sector if this sector reduces. Improvements have been seen in working conditions since some buyer-driven codes of conduct have been put in place. Here also a reference to the Cambodia case, which is described in the study, which I didn't take up here, but there the Better Factories Cambodia program, which linked labor norms, so compliance with labor norms to preferential access to the US market, has helped Cambodia to rise up as an ethical producer. What would be important to investigate here are possible links to home-based production from this industry. Ricardo, am I okay on time? Or?
I'm getting stressed with time, I'm sorry.
Okay. Just to note the importance of services, so in the tourism industry in Kenya, again, many opportunities for women, but a gender segregation of jobs. I've mentioned several constraints that are particularly affecting women. So some of the key success factors in the industry are not as well attained by women as by men. For example, 2 of the 31 companies in this tour operator sector in Nairobi, only 2 of 31 are owned by women. Constraints are related to access to training because of time constraints, effective links to lead firms, which is very crucial in global value chains, also with the inability to travel as much as would be needed. Marketing strategies, male images tend to dominate some of the professions like tour guides, and then women tend to be discarded from these jobs. It depends. Now different actors can react to these patterns in different ways, from lead firms to first-tier suppliers to governments and industry associations and trade unions. I will not go into detail since I don't have time. I had also a case study from Honduras depicting the fruit and vegetable sector, which is interesting from the point of view that women tend to be employed in the higher value-added functions of the chains, however, still based on social norms or perceptions. But again, women tend to take care of jobs which require finesse, and men jobs which require use of machines or management. Depending on the worker category, is it salaried workers, is it contributing family workers, entrepreneurs, the constraints are different and the responses should be tailored differently. Contributing family workers being probably the most invisible and hard to reach category. Okay, all right. So in terms of what different actors can do and how can Aid for Trade help the process, At the same time, global value chains are able to produce development benefits if they are well managed. Aid for trade can help. One should pay attention to where aid for trade is directed. There is a study by Meyer and Milberg on capturing the gains, which says that traditional AFD for infrastructure support does not do the whole job, because from there savings tend to go up the value chain towards the lead firms and first-tier suppliers, whereas also the lower ends of workers and supplier companies, smaller enterprises, would need this support for gender equality to become reality. There is a role for government, civil society, global lead firms, and first-tier suppliers in this, and I think we could maybe discuss it since we don't have the time. Just to end with a note from Aranza Gonzalez. I didn't say anything new, I think. So she tweeted from the General Assembly saying, we see the gap, we mind the gap, and now we should do something about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Johanna, and again, apologies for the time stress. That quote from Arantxa gave us a good tale to then follow with Ruben.
Yes.
And Ruben, we'll have to hear from you almost telegraphically, but I know you're very able and you will be.
Thank you, Ricardo.
You will take us through your things very quickly.
So first of all, I have to thank the ICTSD and the Permanent Mission of Finland in Geneva for inviting ITC to make a presentation. And from the title of the presentation, I see we need to give a practical example. So I'll try my best to be as practical as possible in my presentation. But first, very quickly, I just wanted to share with you. Thank you. I just wanted to share with you very quickly what ITC does. We do a lot of work on value chain development. So we are very active in most African countries. Like, for example, we are doing value chain development in the natural gum and resin sector in Ethiopia, cassava in Zambia, onions in Burkina Faso. You have essential oils in Madagascar, in Comoros Islands. So we are very much active in those countries and in SME development, increasing the competitiveness of SMEs, of smallholder farmers, of micro-enterprises to enable them to add value to their work so that they can increase the value of their goods and services. So let me now take you to the current project we are now developing in the eastern part of Africa. This project is called Promoting Intra-Regional Trade in Eastern Africa. It focuses at two levels. Firstly, at enterprise level, that means at the ground level. So we help smallholder farmers, small enterprises to increase their export competitiveness. So this is in phases now. And secondly, we intervene at what we call the TSI level. This is the medium level. It is at the level of trade support institutions. For example, the Kenya Export Promotion Council, you have the Zambia Honey Council, you have the SIDO, Small Industries and Development Organization of Tanzania. So we basically, what I want to say here is in our effort to increase the competitiveness of SMEs and micro-enterprises, we intervene ground level and then at the intermediary level, at the level of support institutions. So this project it has a duration of 3 years, as you can see, and a budget of 4.2 million euros. The countries we are covering is Kenya, Tanzania, and Zambia, and the sectors honey, mango, spices, and chili. And the donor is the government of Finland. And ITC wishes to thank the government of Finland for helping us to change the lives of people in these three countries. So basically, in a nutshell, as I mentioned a bit earlier, at the enterprise level, what do? We help, firstly, smallholder farmers, micro-enterprises to increase their capacity. We provide advisory services. We have in-house resources, external consultants who work for us. And one area you will see on the slide, empower young traders. So there's some sort of intervention which enables us to create what we call village-based entrepreneurs. So we literally convert the young people to become entrepreneurs. So this contributes to what we call youth empowerment and youth entrepreneurship. And of course, this takes up the gender aspect, and it covers a lot of women. So what do we do with those small enterprises? We enable them to have access to quality compliance and food standards, for example, production improvements, getting adhering to the standards of the regional market. So we literally handhold those small enterprises to enable them to make better products. In the case of Kenya for mangoes and chilies, in the case of Zambia for honey, and in the case of Tanzania, it's chilies and mangoes and spices. Of course, at the ground level, we allow those enterprises to produce better packaging. Why? Because improved packaging means value addition. So when they sell the goods to intermediaries and to buyers, they can get more income. We enable them to participate in international trade fairs and missions so that they can get exposure to the international markets. This is at the ground level, at the micro-enterprise level. At the TSI level, the trade support institutions, these are the multiplier organizations. Basically, they are the government or sectoral associations which provide services to their members, to the small and medium enterprises. So we enable those multipliers to increase their capacity, to provide information, market intelligence. So you can add value to mangoes and chilies, better packaging, but if you don't have access to markets, you don't know where the market is, what are the standards to be met to be able to sell your goods to those markets, then there's a problem. So we provide information services and also how to improve packaging and quality of their goods and services. So, and also in the case of Tanzania and Zambia, we're also doing branding. Branding for buyers internationally, for importers to know the quality of your product. Because you can have a good product, much value added involved, but yet there's no like a brand associated with it. So it's a long-term process which have started last year. So we are contributing to provide a better branding to the products that the three countries are doing right now. Now, very quickly, now I'll just enable you to, I want to share with you what are the cross-cutting goals. Firstly, why do we do all this? It's to create employment. Because when SMEs get better, they grow, they expand, they recruit more people. Employment creation. And our programs involve a lot of private sector participation. I mentioned about youth entrepreneurship a bit earlier. Very importantly, economic empowerment of women, income generation opportunities, and all this for the long-term impact and sustainability. So we want to empower people to become businessmen, businesswomen. We want to enable SMEs to stand on their own feet, to grow, to expand, to export. So this is the aim of this project. And of course, when I mentioned South cooperation, we partner with other institutions. I'll give one example out of many. Mali is a success story in terms of exporting mangoes to Europe. So there was a team of growers of mango from Tanzania who went to learn from Mali how they have been successful. Some of the firms have gone to India, to the Middle East, to learn, to gain knowledge on how to improve their capability. So there's a lot of effort on South cooperation as well. Now, what are the success factors? The third point here is sustainability through replication. It is very important that when you finish the project, it is not that everything stops. It has to continue. Flexibility of implementation plans. I wanted to be practical. It is very important that when we are implementing the project, we take into account the local context, because it is the beneficiary which is at the center of this project. And whenever we go on the ground, where with my colleagues are here, we're implementing the project, we make sure that we are constantly in touch with the government, with the private sector in that country, with the beneficiary, and whenever is required, if we need to take into account changes, we do adapt ourselves very quickly, and also we take into account other work which is